Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I pay my respects to the Indigenous people of this country, and I thank New Zealand for getting there earlier and teaching us in Australia of the debt we owe to the Indigenous people. I am going to observe one of the rules of clarity, and that is I'm going to indicate at the beginning, briefly, the complex matters that I'm going to talk about in this opening session. First of all, I'm going to tell you how I became involved in the mission of Clarity International. Secondly, I'm going to explain what I think are some very simple rules that people in law and in business can adopt that can radically improve the clarity of their communications. And thirdly, I'm going to deal with what I think is the most important message I want to convey, and that is a message of curiosity and impatience about the relative lack of success that this worldwide movement for clarity in expression has enjoyed in the formal legal system. There has been, as this conference indicates, and the variety of wonderful papers, quite a big change in the private sector, and more private sector organisations are getting involved in plain speaking, not only in the English-speaking world, but as our conference will indicate, in countries with different linguistic traditions. But the plain fact of the matter is that in the formal legal system, and by that I mean the judiciary and the practicing law, there is still hostility to the motivation that brings us here together. And it will be appropriate that at the beginning we turn our mind to it and how we can overcome it and what we can do better to make sure that we have more success in the next 20 or so years that I'm going to be around. First of all, how did I get involved? Well, everything in life goes back to your earliest experiences, and I had wonderful parents. My father, they were young, and my father was a great storyteller. And he would sit on the bed with his children and tell them stories. And I think that got into my mind, and I think it helped me to emulate my father and to explain in decisions of the courts in which I've participated the facts of the matter and the legal issues that had to be addressed and the approach that I favoured. I don't wish to appear to be boastful, although a little bit of boastfulness is not out of place. But whenever I go to law schools, I'm surrounded by hundreds of law students, not only in Australia, but mainly in Australia, coming up to tell me how wonderful my decisions were as a judge. Justice Glass once taught me that when people do that, you never interrupt them. But I was curious. I'm still curious about it. What was it? Sir Anthony Mason, who was probably Australia's greatest Chief Justice, has himself said and written that if you want to know what a case is about, you start with the Kirby judgment. You have to go somewhere else after that to find out what the majority decided. But if you want to know what it's all about, that's where you start. So obviously I've been doing something right. And it's therefore important that we should try to study what that is and how I came at it. My father was very good in storytelling. My mother was a wonderful letter writer. I mean, these poor kids of today that don't get letters from their parents, they'll have lots of trivial emails that will disappear into the ether. But my mother wrote letter after letter to all of us. And the genius of her letters was she wrote as she spoke. And that is a problem for us. It's a problem because the English language is schizophrenic. Let's own up to this at the beginning. It's probably true in all languages that they have sources from different linguistic and cultural roots, but it's especially true in the English language because we start out with the fundamental Anglo-Saxon, the Celtic, the language of the Saxons, and then we graft onto it the language of the French clerks who came over with William the Conqueror. And there's been a battle ever since 1066 as to which of those two language groups would have dominance in this increasingly powerful and important international language. And so the English language always has at least two words for every idea. Last, will, and testament. Will, Wille, will, the German word, and testament, the French word. And so that's absolutely wonderful for literature and magnificent for poetry, but it leads to ambiguity and uncertainty in law and in business, and therefore that is the issue for clarity. How did I advance these natural advantages of childhood? By an accident almost, at a very early age, at 35, I was appointed to head the Australian Law Reform Commission. And as a result of that, which I was very reluctant to take, having just been appointed to a judicial office, I came to work with some very, very clever people, very, very clever people in the judiciary, in the law, and in academe. Now, like all those who'd grown up in the practicing profession, I had really a bit of a contempt for academics. I mean, that is the truth of the matter, isn't it? Well, in the practicing profession, you look down at them because they have spent their life teaching and not doing. But the truth is that academics are often much cleverer than the practicing professionals, and they've also got a bit more time to think about the solutions to problems, and they're interested in thinking about the solutions. And so suddenly I was transferred from a workaday barrister dealing with particular cases and not worrying about the big direction of where the ship was going, but just solving the problem of the day, which is, of course, what the practitioners say is the strength of the common law and the English legal system. But suddenly I had to sit down and try to think through how the solutions to a million little cases came together in legal concepts. And I had a wonderful teacher in that regard, an Australian academic from the University of Adelaide named David Kelly. You may have seen his name in law books, David St. L. Kelly, St. Ledger Kelly. And he was a strong proponent of conceptual thinking. And in the earliest days of the Law Reform Commission, we received a reference from the government on drink driving. It was a rather pedestrian sort of thing, but practical, and therefore you could come to grips with it. And so I thought I'd show off, and I spent a whole weekend writing the report. And I thought, well, we can then use that as the basis and attack it and then make it better and stronger. And so the report had a very long chapter. This is what they do in Sweden. This is what they do in Germany. This is what they do in England. This is what they do in Canada. And I went through it all. And so the following morning, on the Monday, Professor Kelly came into my office, and I preened myself as the president, the inaugural president of the Australian Law Reform Commission. He came in bearing my draft report, smiling, beaming, and I thought, oh, can I take all this praise? And he then took it and threw it to the four corners of my big office. And I sat there astonished. And he said, we were asked in this reference to write a report on some basic concepts of the law. Instead, you have written a geography lesson. Now, that was a terribly rude thing for a commissioner to say to the chairman, and it was a terribly rude and shattering thing to say to a person like me. But I've never forgotten it. And he was right. It is hard to get at concepts. You've got to take a lot of data into your brain and then sift them and reduce them further and further, and then you come to what the essence of the problem is. And if you're terribly, terribly busy in a court practice, you really don't have a lot of time to do that. And I hadn't done it really before. It wasn't my job. But now it was my job, and therefore I had to learn how to do it, and I had to concentrate on reduction and conceptualisation. And it isn't a coincidence that David St Ledger Kelly, Commissioner of the ALRC, was a strong proponent of conceptual thinking and also a strong proponent of plain. He was a strong proponent on plain English, as we used to call it, plain language, of plain. And in one of the earliest references that he was in charge of, which was on debt recovery law, he came to the view very early in the piece that many of the poor people who were getting into lots of problems with debt recovery were given documents that they just could not understand, and that we had to grapple with the problem that the law was unclear, but all the documentation was unclear. And so he got in touch with an American professor, Vernon Countryman, and he invited him to have a long conference with us by telephone, which he did, and we had a really enlightening conversation when I had my second moment of truth. And so I also became involved in the plain movement, and since then I've had a lot to do with a lot of the people in North America, John Lindsay and Joe Kimball and many others who have been the leaders of the academic movement for plain language. So that's how I got involved, and I'm proud to be a patron. Sir Kenneth Keith, a very distinguished judge of New Zealand, judge of the Court of Appeal and judge of the International Court of Justice, is the New Zealand patron. And it's a pity that he isn't here today, but I hope that he was invited. I should, for purposes of clarity, make the point that though Joe and I share the same surname, we are not related. This is not a Clinton-like takeover. of the international movement for plain language. Not even a Bush-like takeover. Now, the second thing to say is it's not all that complicated and not all that difficult. And you can have very simple rules. And I've seen in the papers for this conference that people are going to give papers on how you can do plain. And it's, if you have a checklist or a list, Joe Kimball has 40 rules. Well, I tried to reduce it further into 10 rules, which rather presumptuously I called the 10 Commandments. And I have proclaimed the 10 Clarity Commandments. And I'll just go very quickly through them, because if you think about them, you know, you can really make your writing better, easily. It's a simple thing. Begin complex statements of fact and law with a summary. Well, I've done that this morning. You've got to tell people so that they can get the frame of reference in their brains. Secondly, the greatest friend of clarity is the full stop. Lord Denning, if you read his decisions, he was, long before I came, he was the great hero of the students. Why was he a hero? Because they could understand him. And he loved full stops. I contrasted in a paper a passage in Lord Justice McGarry's decision and a passage in an appeal from him to Lord Denning. And Lord Denning had sentences which were 10 words in length. McGarry's first sentence was 75 words, nary a full stop. And so if you want to be loved, you've got to use the full stop. Number 3, you've got to pay attention to layout and headings. I was the king of the headings in the Law Reform Commission, and I took it into the judiciary, and I think the kids love my decisions because I put lots of headings, subheadings, sub-subheading, indent, dot. It's just a matter of clarity. White space is another great friend of clarity. Number 4, vertical lists. Well, I've mentioned that. Number 5, short to medium length sentences, never more than 20 words. Number 6, for continuity between sentences, you can break it up by starting the second sentence with a reprise of the first word or that will link you to the last sentence. Number 7, prefer the active voice to the passive. Number 8, prefer verbs to noun phrases. Consider, not give consideration to. Number 9, prefer familiar words of the Germanic language of our kitchens to the French word of the office. And number 10, delete unnecessary words. The duty of the landlord should just be the landlord's duty. So those 10 commandments are basic structure. No doubt you can shuffle them around and get different combinations, but I think that is the basic information. Now, the next thing is impatience. Why have we not made more progress? I mean, why have we not made more progress? I can tell you why we've not made more progress. It's because that old hostility is still there in the judiciary and the practicing legal profession. I mean, I've been out of the judiciary now for 8 years, and I can share these secrets with you. I mean, what can they do to me? They can't send me off to Devil's Island, not even to Nauru or Manus Island. And it's important that you know, whenever we had a case which was based on a statute where an attempt had been made to write the statute in plain, ho, 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 ho. There would be laughter about the incompetence and how they've overlooked the most basic requirement and how this is not simple, this is more complicated, and this was what always happens when amateurs get involved in the law and they try to mess up our legal system and interfere with the long precedents that we've had. So that is unfortunately the truth of the matter. And how do we overcome that? I've begun to think that something may be related to the Y chromosome about this. I want to get to the bottom of it. I mean, why is this conference 70% women and 30% men? And I think women are more open to new ideas. I hate to be sort of sexist in saying that, but the fact is that women are more open to new ideas. And those old gents in the practicing legal profession are very resistant to the message of clarity and very resistant to the message of change. And maybe it's a generational thing that will change with the change in some of the personalities, but I've got to let you into the secret that the resistance is definitely still there, and therefore that we have a challenge. Now, I want to thank the organisers of this conference. Have you ever seen a conference brochure as beautiful as this? Let's give a big round of applause to the organisers. Look at the lovely colours. I mean, New Zealand, Australia is a wonderful, big, vibrant country, but New Zealand is one of the most beautiful jewels in the world. And the layout, the presentation. I went through the list of subjects. You know, it's just wonderful, the list of subjects you are going to hear. They're all up there. It's very distracting for a speaker to see everybody. No one's looking at them. They're always looking at what in the hell's he going to sit down so we can get on to the next session. But I can understand it because the next session is tremendously fascinating. I've got a list of them all. If I had time, I'd just tell you the variety of the subjects we're going to have in this conference, and it is fantastic. The conference is a real masterpiece, and I thank those who organised it. But somehow we're not getting the message as efficiently and quickly into the positions of power. And that is what we have to really spend a bit of time thinking about. And I'm getting a bit impatient because time's running out, and I'd like to do what I can to encourage you to think of how we can get more sympathy and empathy in what is fundamentally an efficiency, an economic and a justice point. And that should be a theme going through our minds during the whole of this conference. This is a justice point. This is making the law communicate more effectively to the users of the law. And the ho-ho-ho people who want to keep the obstacles have to be told to mind their business and get out of the way. Okay, well, that's basically all I came to tell you in this opening. If I have to, I'll officially launch and open the Clarity Conference 2016, and we will have a short Q&A, but before that, a big round of applause. Thank you. Now, we began 5 minutes late, Joe, cousin Joe, and therefore I've got 5 minutes of Q&A.
You do. And there's 2 microphones at the side, so if anyone has a question, if they could go to one of the microphones and speak into the microphone.
Well, I see one of my heroes, Bob Hulse, is here, and he's on to, and he's been a politician, and he's seen it. I hope in his session he talks about this resistance. It's a resistance. It's an iceberg, and we're in the Titanic. We've got to get rid of the iceberg. Okay.
Judge Trisharden, solicitor from Blaney in Australia. Do you think a lot of the problem with the practicing lawyers is the time they have to redraft the documents? That's one of my issues. I read them. I redrafted a document a couple of weeks ago because I just couldn't stand it. But it took me so long, and it's not time I can charge for. But it was so incoherent. I had to.
I understand that problem. You know, I used to hear that my colleagues in the High Court of Australia would read their drafts 3 times. I read my drafts at least 8 and usually up to 13 times. Always struggling. When I did the report on North Korea for the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which created a sensation when it was delivered to the Human Rights Council, because they'd never seen such a report that was clear and that used the quotes of the victims throughout to speak directly. Terribly powerful, but it's the way we do reports in the Anglo-Saxon world. I think the fact that I took such pains over every word, but it is very time consuming. And I was a Justice of the High Court and it just had to be done. But basically I just worked harder. You know, I would get in earlier and I would work harder. And that's been made a bit more difficult by the cursed emails and now the social networks that distract people. But time is important, and what David Kelly taught me is really important lessons. Try, it's harder, but try to be conceptual and reduce. It's all reducing to the essence of it. And also, and there's a wonderful example in Una's paper, the Solicitor General's paper, which you're going to hear of a passage in the original New Zealand Interpretation Act that goes on, and then it was re-expressed in a sharp essence of it. So, okay, it is time-consuming, but you should pay for it. They should pay for it. You should charge for it. It's getting it down to the essence, because the essence is going to be more impactful, it's going to last longer, and it's going to be more efficient. Clarity is economical in the long run. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Come forward. Line up. And then that'll have to be it. Yes.
Hi, I'm Megan from a business design studio called Empathy. We have our own tactics for trying to kind of reduce the resistance of lawyers by explaining some of the risky behaviours we see that we're trying to help in real people. What tactics have you found have been most successful in just kind of cutting down the resistance to plain language?
Well, I'd be interested to ask you a question.
Go ahead.
Rather like Trump, you see.
You can come to my session.
Just ask a question back. But I want to know, in business, do business people say, well, we'll just leave this to you, this is your bag and you get on with it? Or is there hostility in business also? If people have a precedent, they don't want to let go their precedent. And if it's been done this way for years, they're worried that if you do it a different way, then maybe you'll forget or overlook something. Ho, ho, ho. You will not be doing it the way we've been doing it for years. So I just think people in Clarity have just got to be braver and stronger and bolder to get over this hump of resistance, because it's definitely there in public sector environments, and I would suspect it's also there in business too.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jong-gu Park from South Korea. This morning, I want to briefly talk about the case in my country. Korea government introduced 10-year plans for plain language project, especially in legal language. It's already been 10 years since we introduced that project. However, many Korean people feel find that it is very difficult to understand in our statute. I think the main reason for that is Chinese character and Japanese style terminology in our statute. So I want to have your appropriate advice to solve our problem if you have any similar experience in your country.
Well, I'm very glad you came forward, and I see there is a session in the conference on plain in Japanese. I was in Tokyo a week ago. I was there to discuss LGBTIQ rights. And I was told that the impediment is not so much law as cultural, attitudinal, and so on. It's not even religious, because they don't have a God with a long beard in the sky being nasty to LGBT people. But so I don't underestimate the difficulties of getting people to change settled ways, and particularly in an ancient and noble culture like Japan. But I was told the younger people coming along, particularly young women who are now asserting their entitlements, that things are changing, and that is something that is good for Japan. But the impediments are not just legal, they are attitudinal, cultural, and it'll be a good thing if they are discussed in the course of the conference. Now, you had a further supplementary question, I think. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's it, or we get behind, and if you're in a Clarity conference, you've got to stick to schedule. So thank you very much for having me. As I'm after my very large state funeral, as I'm lowered into my eternal rest, I'll be shouting out, "Clarity, clarity." Simplicity, brevity, but the greatest of these is clarity.